Lunchtime panel discussion with the Central Arizona State Planning Council. The topic of this afternoon is elder care and estate planning. We have an esteemed panel of local experts that will address a number of pre-ordered questions, and as the program generates more questions, we will attempt to answer them here. Before we start, a few helpful pieces of information. For questions, use the live chat box on your screen. And for follow-up questions, when this is no longer a live seminar, use email at webinars@kjzz.org. This program will last about an hour. Elder care and estate planning often go hand in hand, with hopefully the planning being done before the care is required. In this niche area of professional expertise, there are some key players such as legal, investments, senior services, fiduciary services, and we have representatives from these industries with us on the panel. Our panelists are Charles McCullough from the Area Agency on Aging, Greg Furseth from Trust Bank, Roger Coventry from Childers and Coventry, and Stacy Johnson from Fenimore Craig. I am Steve Taddy, your moderator, and on behalf of KJZZ, KBOC, and the Central Arizona State Planning Council, thanks for joining us. To give our listeners some color on what these professionals bring to the table, I'd like to go down the table and have our panelists briefly describe the services that someone in their profession would provide the public. Greg.
Thanks, Steve. Well, the services we provide are fiduciary and investment services for our clients, and working with the attorneys on their estate planning and making sure that everything's in place so when certain things occur, we have everything pre-planned and we can make sure the families are taken care of through the generations. Those are the key things. I primarily practice in the fiduciary side, and that is actually taking care of families, making sure the documents that the families come up with and the attorneys have come up with can be executed, and everybody's interests are watched out and protected. So.
Okay. Stacy.
Good afternoon, Steve. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm an elder law attorney. I practice at the law firm of Fenimore Craig. The law firm is a very robust firm that provides a lot of services, legal services to the community. In particular, in my area of practice, we handle matters such as estate planning, trust and estate administration. We also, in the elder care area, provide community referrals and legal assistance to families and other professionals who may need information or guidance with an elder adult or with an adult who's incapacitated and can no longer meet their own needs. So the firm can provide those elder care services as well as the planning side of things. And we work with other professionals in the community and provide community referrals as needed. We work with people like Roger Coventry and Childers and Coventry as well.
Wonderful, thanks. Roger.
Yes, Childers and Coventry is a licensed fiduciary firm in Arizona, and like other licensed fiduciaries, the essence of our profession is that we make decisions for folks who are unable to make their decisions or have otherwise named us in an agency capacity to make those decisions for them. We can act as a court-appointed guardian, a conservator, a personal representative to administer an estate, as trustee, and like I said earlier, agent under power of attorney. And other licensed fiduciaries in this state will have the same sort of capacity.
Okay, wonderful. Charles.
Thank you, Steve. Well, as you might guess from the name, the Area Agency on Aging provides services to older adults. Most of our programs are targeted to that population, although we do have one that's HIV/AIDS at any age. So we have programs. I'm associated with the Benefits Assistance Program, or SHIP, a State Health Insurance Assistance Program, where we counsel people on their Medicare options. 10,000 people a day are turning 65, so they all need help with figuring out what to do, and there are lots of choices available to them. We also help people that have problems with Medicare, either billing or they lost coverage for whatever reason, so we help with situations like that. Some of our other programs are sales, senior adult independent living, where we're trying to keep people in their homes, taking care of themselves rather than being in an institution. We have a program that helps people when they're discharged from the hospital to make sure that the follow-up is being taken care of so that they don't get readmitted. The gatekeeper for most of our programs is the senior helpline, and the senior helpline is available 24 hours a day so that we can have resources available to people. And they do a triage. They figure out what services are needed and then direct the beneficiary to that service. We have elder refugee and Native American programs where we're focusing on those populations. Finally, there's an ombudsman program where we basically we're providing some oversight of assisted living facilities. We can deal with complaints, just check to see that they're up to snuff.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, and coming back to you on the topic of community resources that are available, what are some of the most popular and some of the most used programs in your organization, for example?
Well, of course, I see it firsthand with benefits assistance. As I mentioned, there are lots of people turning 65 every day, so we get a lot of calls that way. Used to be that in the summertime things tapered off. We get very busy during the open enrollment period in the fall, but in the last couple of years with the growth in the senior population, we're just seeing year-round busyness.
Okay. Other members of the panel, any other thoughts on services that might be available through the community or professional communities that we're involved in for individuals?
Well, I'll start off by saying
Okay.
that Arizona Long-Term Care System is probably the one that we hear of the most, and that's typically for someone who's indigent or otherwise qualifies. There's a financial qualification that's necessary and a medical qualification, but that seems to be a fairly common accessed resource.
Okay,
And
thanks.
Steve, we're seeing a large increase in the special needs trusts that work, in that environment, you do work with Altex and Social Security and those types of things, as we're having it seems like a very large growth of children that can't take care of themselves, and the parents are worried about if they get a large pool of money that they'll be harmed. And they may be on government benefits, so the special needs trust allows that the government care can be in place and the trust can be in place for the other things. So it's a very niche part of our business, but it's growing.
Okay, great.
Steve, I find that in my practice as an elder law attorney, I'm in court quite a bit, but my objective is to avoid being in court. My objective is to help not only on the planning side, but if the planning is deficient or doesn't exist, to provide my clients and their families with community resources as much as possible. The Area Agency on Aging is one of the resources I often provide my clients. On their website and in hard copy, they have a resource guide for Maricopa County, which is a wonderful resource guide for seniors. I also work with an organization called Duet. Duet helps seniors who are homebound stay in their home as long as possible, and they do provide volunteer services to assist those folks who can't get out with things like grocery shopping, bill paying, organizing their paperwork, friendly visiting, things of that nature. So my objective is to keep my clients and their families out of court as much as possible and to put community resources in place that will assist them as long as possible to avoid needing to go to court or needing to get some type of other legal authority.
Wonderful. Well, panel, that was a great review of services that are available. In this environment, the buyer beware environment, what kind of regulatory oversight governs each of your practices? Charles, any regulatory oversight that you have to deal with?
Well, not directly, although most of our funding comes from either grants or there's government funding, so there are stipulations associated with all of that. The agency is also accredited by the Council on Accreditation, so we go through, I believe it's a 4-year process, a cycle where we're periodically accredited.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Roger, how about in your field? I'm sure you've got all kinds of regulations.
Yes, and it is rightfully so. We have a huge amount of responsibility, and the Arizona Supreme Court, through the Administrative Office of the Courts, oversees our practice through their licensing program, and in that they do audits, and there's probably additional oversight within that program. Also, in cases where we're appointed by the Superior Court of Arizona, there's oversight by the judicial officers, by the attorneys that are appointed. There's court-appointed counsel for people who are in need of protection. So there's not only the regulation, but also the professionals, the associate or affiliated professionals that will keep an eye on what we're doing, keep us honest, and make sure we're doing the right thing.
Okay. And Stacy, yourself, probably a bevy there as well.
Well, I'm not sure a bevy, but certainly some pretty heavy hitters. We have the Superior Court of Arizona overseeing, as Mr. Coventry indicated, what we do when we go to court, and we are providing services to folks who need a court-appointed fiduciary to represent their interests. So we have oversight from the court. The court not only looks at what's happening in the case, but the court also is evaluating the fees and costs that are being charged to make sure that they're reasonable and appropriate given the needs of the individual. Then, of course, we have the State Bar of Arizona, which is an interesting entity because it's a member organization that we pay to belong to, but it's one of its primary objectives is protection of the public. So it's a wonderful entity that monitors all attorneys, not just attorneys in this area of practice. So we have those two main bodies looking at us.
Wonderful, wonderful. Hey, Greg.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and Roger, our practices kind of mirror on the fiduciary and personal rep, so we kind of share that, what we have to protect ourselves and our clients and make sure we do things right. Where we differ is our powers come from this banking regulations. So we're regulated by the different banking authorities, from the Federal Reserve down to the FDIC to the state of, we have practices in Illinois and Arizona, so those two states come in, and at any given time they can come in, and Roger, you probably had this with the state, say, give me 10 of your files, and they will just go through them and see what you've done for the last 3 or 4 years. And that's a real good protection for the public, because they know that an independent is overseeing us. And it's not fun going through those, but it's something we do and we take very seriously.
Well, that's good. And I know in my specific field with investment advisory, we have to deal with the SEC, the state of Arizona ad nauseum. And it's a very highly regulated field that we all practice in, which is for the benefit of the clients. Absolutely. You know, in seeking benefits and assistance, there's always questions top of mind on clients' heads. And when they first come in to talk with you, what are some of the first things, Stacy, that someone comes in and has questions about?
Well, as Charles indicated, we have clients who are interested in benefits assistance with Medicare. We have clients who are interested, as Greg indicated, in special needs trust and protecting maybe an adult disabled child who may not be able to manage on their own, and the family wants to protect the benefits assistance that they're getting from the state. And some people have pretty diverse views on whether or not that's appropriate, but that's part of the planning process, and what an attorney or benefits counselor can assist with is reviewing the options so that the families can decide what fits best in their situation. Those are probably the key areas that we as legal counselors work with.
Okay. Roger, how about yourself?
You know, we get this quite a bit. Folks who are doing their estate planning are thinking ahead to when they might need public assistance, and they've sometimes heard rumors and miscommunication about what is available and the parameters that they would have to meet. So a lot of folks believe that they have to be indigent, can't own a home, can't own a car, can't have a job, and a lot of the benefits don't have that kind of a test where you have to be indigent. So there are a lot of benefits available without having to be indigent. Additionally, people ask about whether or not they'll have to pay back, or their estate will have to pay back any benefits that they might receive during their lifetime, and in some cases the answer is yes. So we try to help them guide them through that. And also, as Stacy mentioned, there are options for people who have assets that may be placed in trust, which would then allow them to qualify financially for certain programs.
I know I asked Charles that question earlier, so I'm going to skip right to Greg. Most common question when people come in your office, what is it?
Well, it's not about government services, I'll say that. So that is the one. But Social Security, I guess, would be the one. I think the most common when we're called, and I get a lot of calls out of the blue, recommendations from different people, and they'll say, what does a trust company do? That's one question. And how does that work? How do we appoint you? And then how does the process work? So you can walk through there. Those are the most common. Then each one is then unique. my goal is to work with the counselor that they're working with, and I always tell them, so they'll put on paper what we do, I'll tell you how I do it, and they better meet in the middle, and if they don't, then we gotta get back to work. Because you think of a trust as simply a roadmap, or it's a contract, but it's a roadmap of, at this point in my life, I wanted to do this point, and what's unique about the trust is it can go through different phases of life, even after death of children. And those are questions you get. How does all this work? And you have to, you just kind of share them through. But the biggest thing is find out where are they and what are their questions. And then you just kind of help them through, because you really plan in their life. You're helping them plan their life.
Well, it's important because a question that someone doesn't ask, they don't know the answer to.
So I have stock things that I'll ask them through. What we try to do is get them thinking through what do they want to occur in different phases. That's really the primary way. Because then you know which, and especially if they don't have an attorney, then you know what attorney to refer them to, which would help them. Because we work a lot with Stacy's firm, because they have very, very good professionals, and they can help them. But it's always nice to, when I get those calls, I can help them out of the gate. And I have a lot of people don't know. Well, they don't want to think about dying. So, but the one thing I say is, like, have you thought about incapacity? And that's where you guys all come in. Is like, or you have medical stations, and that's where we're starting to help a little bit more. So,
And on that, I mean, the old adage, an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. Stacy, my guess is you're oftentimes in the prevention business, you know, trying to structure things so that things don't go badly down the road. What planning can be done to limit future legal liabilities and legal issues?
Steve, that's a great question, and the adage is so applicable to this area in particular, because my practice involves sort of two main aspects of elder care. The estate planning side, which I strongly encourage people to look at regardless of age. If you're an adult, you need to be thinking about an estate plan for a main reason that Greg had indicated, which is not just planning for what you have and what's going to happen to it when you pass, but what's going to happen to you and your assets while you're still alive but unable to make or communicate decisions for yourself. So my practice is on the planning side and the prevention side, and along those lines, you know, I've talked to a number of people when things haven't gone well and the planning wasn't done. And the reason the planning wasn't done, as Greg said, is they don't want to think about those types of issues, or they just didn't want to spend the money. And what happens then in consequence is you end up spending a lot more money. You have strangers involved in your business. You have the courts involved in your business if you don't do that planning. And so that prevention really is worth a pound of cure. And coming in and talking to a professional about the options and about the advantages of planning really helps to stave off some of those more costly and emotionally difficult issues down the road.
Wonderful. Panel, any other thoughts or follow-up thoughts?
Yes, Steve, may I ask just to piggyback on that, because I had a case this morning that I was in court on, where the person just kind of refused to update their planning, even though we suggested it, strongly suggested it, over a period of years. And now we are in the incapacity issue, and I was in a court hearing to get trustee powers put in place, which was done, but a guardianship appointed for them, because you got to protect the person. That, you know, I can't do anything for people, so you need a guardian. And so I had 5 attorneys in this courtroom to handle this, and I don't know how much it's going to cost. I'll see those bills. That all we need to do is have 2 little things put in place beforehand. And
If they were done before, it would have saved
it would have saved
a lot of heartache.
a lot of heartache too, because
Yeah.
now the person's very upset. But as I say, once you get into where you have to involve the courts, you lose control of timing, and you lose control of what you can do within the accounts until the court rules. So you're in the investment business. We were talking about that earlier. Like, the investments can get frozen. How do you pay bills? How do you take care of them? All those things can really spiral out of control if you have a bad situation until the courts, you can get in the court docket, and well, you know how long that takes. It could take a month or 2 or 3 sometimes.
Yeah.
So
Understood. Any other thoughts?
Steve, I want to add one
Yeah.
other thing, and that is with regard to living wills and advance directives, I think a lot of folks don't give that enough time and consideration when they're doing their estate planning. It's almost an afterthought. And for the fiduciary, from our side, when we're having to make a decision for the person and they're very vague in their living will, it makes it harder for us because we then have to make a judgment or decision not based on their values and what they would want, but sometimes we substitute our own values for what they would want. And so I suggest that people give that a lot of thought, put it in detailed writing, even if it's not part of the living will. Create a writing that explains in detail what kind of decisions you would want made for yourself if you can't articulate those decisions. And on top of that, tell family, tell friends, tell other people, so that you don't end up on a ventilator with a legal battle at the end of your life.
Agreed. Okay, if someone doesn't have their affairs in order before they're incapacitated or they die, what happens? I mean, what's the process like? Let's go down the worst avenue we can. Roger, I know you've been down that path with certain things. What is the process?
Well, it varies. There's a lot of things where the legal system can come in and put some protection in place, but depending on the situation, there may not be a logistical or practical solution. And some examples are when a person is highly mobile, they are incapacitated, but they're resisting care. It's very difficult to find law enforcement or transportation or other services that will provide the help needed when the person is resisting, which could end up in having to go back to court for a very specific order. But again, it starts to come down to what order will a law enforcement or some other provider, what order will they abide by and actually provide services to someone who doesn't want them. I want to live in my house. I do not want to go to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
It's my choice to die. I've heard a lot and seen a lot of scenarios where even though there's a lot of folks ready, willing, and able to help, the person is resistant. And it's frustrating, and there's not a perfect solution, but this is one of those things that happen when you didn't plan for your incapacity, and you didn't plan that you would be resistant to someone else's help. So now what?
Other thoughts and comments from the group?
Well, Steve, again, dovetailing on what Roger just said, it's not that being resistant or deciding not to accept help, deciding not to seek medical treatment is itself a problem. We can make decisions all day long for ourselves so long as we have the capacity to do that. And in the state of Arizona, we have a statute that tells us when somebody's incapacitated. For purposes of making personal decisions, it's when you have some type of mental or physical disability, and there are other reasons under the statute, but generally medical or physical disability that prevents you from making or communicating informed, responsible decisions for yourself. And so just making bad choices is not a reason to run to the court. But as Roger said, if somebody's incapacitated, they really are unable to make those decisions for themselves, and they're resistant to the assistance of others. Even a court order, that's a piece of paper. If we can't get some kind of, again, community support of other professionals, and encourage this individual to cooperate, it can be very difficult. For the majority of cases, I would suggest that we get the court intervention when the planning hasn't been done, and the individual is provided for, those decisions are made for them considering their wants and needs and their wishes. And generally it goes pretty well. But you've still, without the planning, you've still put yourself in a position to have strangers involved in your life and have your life a matter of public record with the court and involving the court in that process.
Okay. On the topics of trust, being a planning vehicle, the thing that everybody wants to have really buttoned up so that things do run smoothly, what are some of the difficulties faced in administering a trust? I guess might be a good question for you to start on.
Okay, thanks, Steve. The primary difficulties you have when you think of a trust, you have your instructions that are laid out in the trust agreement, you have your assets, and you have your family situation. So they're all distinct entities that you're trying to deal with. So the real difficulties come from if you have family members that are already fighting, and you're trying to make decisions in the trust and take care of everybody. That's one thing. You could have terms in the trust that are just challenging. And as Roger had said, the one unique thing in what both he and I do together is we have to make decisions to put out assets for purposes either to take care of a person or give them income or give them principal or everything, and we have to apply what the document says, and it's our decision, it's on us, so we take on that liability. So that's one inherent thing, a challenge in a trust, any trust that's out there being administered, whether it's a corporate, a licensed fiduciary, or an individual, we all have the same standard. So you want to be able to understand all your variables before you jump in and start doing things, and each one is unique, and so there isn't one size that fits all.
And I would imagine
That's
that
the challenge. So
I would imagine an individual stepping in to be a trustee for Uncle Joe's trust may not have any idea the potential liability issues they have in doing that.
that is correct, because they're held to the same statutory rules that we are as corporate trustees, and that's the change when we had the Uniform Trust Code passed about 6-7 years ago, and they don't understand the liability. Another one is when you have children, you want, well, I'll have one son or one daughter be the trustee, and you have 4 or 5 siblings, and parents have passed away, and how do you make decisions on who's going to get what because you have the discretionary authority? That can cause a lot of family issues. So it's not only the time, the expertise, but also the emotional side of a family, and we sometimes forget that. But those of us that are in this, dealing with it every day, that's the hardest part of our job, is managing the emotional side of the family and making sure all those needs are met. Because when you, especially if you have a death, those emotions, it doesn't matter how old the kids are, if they're 60 or 70, those emotions come up from when they're 10, 11, 12 years old. They just never forget them. So that's kind of the art of our business.
Okay.
But it's just getting it right is our goal. Just getting it right.
Okay. Other thoughts?
To piggyback on what Greg said, from the administrative standpoint, one of the challenges we've had is when a person's made multiple amendments to their trust, and I've seen as many as 30 plus amendments, which may have made sense at any given point, but lately the trend I see, which I like, is a total restatement of the trust, because for the administration of the trust, there are sometimes provisions that refer to other provisions within the trust, and if the drafter or the person who's creating the amendment is not careful, they could be in conflict, some internal conflict within the trust, which it turns out we'll end up in court sometimes asking the court for instruction. What does this all mean? So a recommendation would be that if you find yourself making the 5th or more amendment to the trust, that you consider making a complete restatement of the trust, which basically gives us an easier document to work with.
That's exactly right, because mistakes can occur when you get the 30. We both have had those in play. So another part is when they change attorneys. So if you have one attorney does one set of documents and have somebody come in and do an amendment, and if they don't pick a highly competent attorney, that's when I really see the problems, because that attorney didn't go back and refer to the other document.
And that's right back to Roger's point on
Right.
just things that don't line
They
up.
just don't line up, and
Yeah.
you'll be calling Stacy's firm and say, we got to go to court and petition the court for instruction. Another big area that is a challenge is what's called powers of appointment, both general and limited powers. Those are things when you can give somebody a what if down the road, and I've seen a lot of powers try to be exercised in later documents, and they don't refer back to the original source of the power, and you're telling somebody they can't do what they can do. I had one where they wanted to exercise millions of dollars to go to another family member. It's like, well, you don't have the authority to do that.
Oops.
That's one of those challenging
Yeah.
situations you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And how are you going to undo that? Can you undo it? Sometimes, Roger would say, our hands are tied. It's what the document says.
And Stacy, I'm sure you get involved in this. People wanting to do an amendment versus a whole document, and that ounce of planning.
That's right. And sometimes, Steve, people have very specific ideas in mind as to what they want to have done with their documents. And it's important as attorneys to counsel clients on what the available options are to make sure that what they want to have happen is accomplished in the manner that is most efficient and most cost effective. But it's easy to Google information these days and get maybe some bad information, maybe some good information, but there's just nothing that really replaces sitting down with an attorney who's competent in the area, to review what it is you want to make sure that it's done in the right way. Because if it's not done, as Greg indicated, we often end up in court to try to fix it and to try to determine what the individual wanted and how we get there. In terms of administration, if I might also just, when a family member's serving, the son or the daughter, and they just want to help mom or dad or their siblings and they're willing to do the work, it is crucial to consult with a competent planning or administration attorney, because as both of these gentlemen have indicated, it's very easy to get the administration wrong, even unintended consequences. And so you don't want to be looking at allegations from other family members that you've breached your duty to as a trustee to the beneficiaries of the trust. You want to make sure you're doing that job correctly, because the potential consequences and liability are pretty significant.
Yeah, understood. I'm going to keep going down this rabbit hole on trust, and we're going to broaden it out a little bit. On trust, distributions seem like the simplest thing in the world. You want a distribution from a trust, you get it. It's pretty easy. But Greg, there's got to be some problems with some of these distributions. Can you maybe give the listeners a good overview of the common permissible and non-permissible distributions from a trust?
Okay, so the easy ones, we'll start with those.
Yeah.
You have a document that says you shall pay all the income on a quarterly or more often basis. That's easy, you just set that up. Then you can have what's called a 5x5 power in there, and that tells the trustee in a certain window of time that this beneficiary is entitled to 5% of the assets, usually in January, but they have to exercise that power that I talked about. And that's an easy one because it's all directed by the trust. So where you get into the types of distributions that we deal with that are challenging, or they're called discretionary distributions. So there is no set of rules that says you have to do X. So usually you will start with a standard called health, education, support, and maintenance. That is the most common standard. The standard was put in place for tax purposes. We won't go into that. It's another seminar you can have.
Okay.
But that is why and they call it an ascertainable standard. That's the term. And that allows that whoever's making the decision, that the person that's getting the money, they have no control. So, well, what is health? The more data we can get from the person who drafted the trust and who the grantors were, it makes it easier. But health is pretty cut and dry in today's world. Education is not. So you have a 3-year-old that's going to a fancy school in Connecticut, which I have had, that is at $150,000 a year. Is that prudent for that trust to do it? So that's an extreme thing. Then how do you define education? You get up into the colleges. I have a daughter in college, so I know all about this. Are they going to be able to study abroad? Do you pay for housing? So when you start getting into what the actual expenses for is, health, education, support, maintenance doesn't always help you. Now we have some other things like Scott on Trust, and then we have statutory rules, and we have some things, but that's the hardest part on how to do it. What's maintenance? So the basic rule of thumb that we all start with is, when you have a new beneficiary, you aren't going to raise their standard of living, you're not going to lower it. That's usually your starting point. And then you just dig into the document, you try to find as much history. I tell a lot of attorneys and grantors, like, hey, if they could write just a letter on what they want, that just helps me when I'm going to committee and getting it approved. So, but it's definitely not. That's why every major trust company has a discretionary committee.
Okay.
And they review all of them and they have to approve them. So.
Sound counsel. Any other thoughts?
I've got a couple of points to make
Yeah.
on that. First of all, special needs trusts, which we've mentioned a couple of times today. We administer the special needs trust. It used to be a lot more rigorous in terms of what can or can't be spent for the support of the beneficiary. I have a special needs handbook in my office. It's the thickest book in my office. It's probably well over 500 pages, and it's a very technical trust to administer. So I don't really recommend that to a lay person, someone who doesn't work in this profession or have worked in this profession, because it's technical, and you could end up costing the beneficiary benefits. But it has, over the last few years, gotten a little bit easier, because a lot of what used to not be permissible are now permissible distributions. The one thing for special needs trusts you almost certainly don't want to make is a cash distribution, or something that could be considered to be a cash distribution. because depending on the benefits, they may have an offset against those benefits because of that. Then, with regard to the non-special needs trust, just trust in general, the one thing that I see a lot is when a beneficiary obligates the trust themselves, and they typically will submit an invoice or a receipt and ask to be reimbursed. And a lot of them do this over and over again. What they don't understand, and I try to communicate to them, is part of the benefit of having a trust is it's a separate entity. It protects those assets in the trust from creditors. If it becomes nothing more than a piggy bank for the beneficiary, then the creditors will have a good argument to say they owe us money. We're going to reach our hand into that piggy bank and take it. So
That's a good point.
you really,
Yeah.
you can't let the, if you're administering a trust, you can't let the beneficiaries continuously obligate the trust in that way. And there may be some exceptions, but that's one thing I see that happens quite often. The beneficiaries don't really understand in some cases what effect that will have.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent. So in terms of trends in elderly clients, Charles, you're at the front lines. You probably get a lot more people in your door on a daily basis than all of us combined. What trends do you see affecting the elderly clients here in Arizona?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. First off, people are living longer, and they're active and involved in the decision making well into their 90s in many cases. So that's a factor. You turn 65, you don't make short-term decisions anymore. You may have another 30 years to consider. The other thing is technology. Our clients are very actively using technology. We've upgraded our website to reflect that. We're trying to give them the tools to participate in the decisions they need to make. If they're not able to, we'll do the work for them, but we encourage them to get involved. We tell them how to use the tools, and Medicare is not an issue that you make a decision when you're 65. You make decisions every year that affect your Medicare, and we try to impart that to our clients.
Good advice. Good advice. Members of the panel.
Steve, I think there are a number of trends that I see, but the top three sort of go along with what Charles indicated. The first is we have the baby boomers who are aging, and what old means, I think, has changed significantly, and people are living longer. They're living healthier, more robust lives. As the baby boom generation ages, as they start to need care, the second trend we see is the ratio of available caregivers versus the need. So you may have a larger number of available caregivers as compared with older adults who need care now than you may in 10, 15, 20 years from now. And the third trend that I see is in the long-term care aspect of things. As adults are aging, as the population ages, more and more people are looking at what long-term care means for them. Does it mean they can stay in their home? Does it mean they have to go into some type of residential placement? What does their life look like? And do those people who are aging have the resources to stay in their home? And what is available to them as they age and as their needs increase? So those are the three areas that I see really changing over the next probably 10 to 20 years.
Well, since I've been in this profession, the one thing I've seen as a trend is that folks no longer think of a care home as the institution that's white, lifeless, hospital-like. They've gotten out or seen on websites that a lot of these new care homes, assisted living homes, are beautiful. They're resort-like. They have amenities. They have activities, and there's a good chance for social interaction. And so I think that the attitude is changing toward the idea that, instead of living in your home with caregiving, which is very expensive, that living in an assisted living facility or a care home is a much more palatable choice for many seniors now.
I agree with that. And a lot of them, you can go from that independent, still be very independent, but you have that backstop that as you go through, you have limited care, and then more assisted living. And then they also have usually a health center that if you have to get rehab, it's all on site. And the new one I'm seeing a lot of it, Roger, see if you're seeing a lot more memory care. being added at the facilities. So that means a husband and wife can be closer together and not separated like we were doing 10 years ago. But I'll add one last trend I'm seeing is the breakup of the family, the dysfunction in the families. It just seems to be much larger than it was 10 years ago, and children coming after their parents for money, and more of a challenging relationship of I need my money now has been something I've observed a lot more. And I told you about the case I just dealt with, where a stepson was handling a client's money, and she's down to $1 million, and she's gifted him already about $1.2 million, and he said, I can't do gifts anymore, so he fired her. And then he sent a letter to a local firm and was able to freeze her accounts, and we're trying to unwind all that. So now this poor lady can't even get to her accounts, just because she doesn't want to run out of money, because their fear is they're going to run out of money with the health care and everything else.
Well, that running out of money, marrying up, Charles, with your comment about people living well into their 90s. 20 years ago, a couple that was 65 years old and retired thought they might have had all the money in the world to get through retirement. They now find themselves at 85, still healthy, but for one fact of their life, they don't have enough money to get from 85 to 90. And I think that's also a trend that we're seeing, because these care homes, Roger, that you mentioned, they're not cheap. And I think the savings that that individuals have to go through today versus where they thought they had to be 20 years ago is just increased because of that increased lifespan.
Steve, that's true, and in part, when you do the planning with folks, you can talk with them about those types of issues as well as long-term care insurance for those needs that may come up later in life.
Exactly.
Stacey, since you mentioned long-term care, and I'm not an advocate or against one way or the other, but something people need to be careful of, if you are able to find a long-term care policy, is look at the conditions, because some of the conditions are so narrow that the likelihood of you actually being able to benefit from that policy may be very slim. And I've seen that, unfortunately, someone's paid into it for 10, 15 years, comes time to use it, and there's one condition that's not met, they can't use it.
Yes.
Now, we've danced into some areas that are really fertile ground for elder abuse. What is elder abuse? Let's define elder abuse, and then let's talk about some of the signs to look for so you can help identify elder abuse. Charles, what do you think? What are some things you've seen?
Well, one thing to look out for is when somebody withdraws from their normal activities, their normal circle of friends. That's a red flag right there. And elder abuse does not have to be physical. It does not have to be financial. It could be emotional. Somebody could be purposely isolated a senior. So that's one thing that we look for.
Okay. Roger, how about yourself? I mean, you've probably seen a few cases.
Unfortunately, I've seen quite a few, and the ones that disturb me the most are the physical abuse. And that's not necessarily where someone laid hands on somebody, but maybe neglected to change their undergarments or let them get up out of bed so they develop decubitus ulcers, or they don't feed or hydrate the person properly. There's a lot of things that go on that may not seem like it's proactive abuse, but it's neglect or even self-neglect. But typically, I've seen just about everything now in my 15 years as a fiduciary. It's very unfortunate. The financial exploitation is rampant, and I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg of that. A lot of folks won't report it because then they've been told by the exploiter in many cases that if you tell the authorities that I'm doing this, I will not love you anymore, or you're not going to be able to be in my life anymore, or a lot of things where it's a very unfortunate situation to see. It's happening out there. Stacy's seen it. I think all of us have seen it. Exploitation and abuse. I think that we as a society have to look at this as a national disgrace, that we're not putting forth enough effort to stop it, to punish it, to make sure our elders are protected and can live out their lives peacefully.
Steve, I think what Roger said is spot on, as well as with what Charles said. in my area of practice, one of the things I do is I pursue exploiters regarding financial exploitation in the civil court, in the civil arena. We try to stop the financial exploitation. Sometimes that involves reaching out to banks and having them freeze accounts. Sometimes that involves going to court and getting orders for certain things. The physical abuse, of course, is, in my opinion, far more important than the financial abuse. Trying to take care of an individual who's being physically abused, especially when they don't want to withdraw from the situation. That gets into a whole conversation about why people don't want to be separated from the person who's taking advantage of them or neglecting them or abusing them. As Roger indicated, sometimes there's the emotional threat that Charles referenced, sort of the emotional abuse and the threat of something that the person is more afraid of than a physical abuse or financial exploitation. What folks really need to understand is that there are things that can be done to help somebody who is a victim of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. The law, Steve, you asked, let's define it. The law defines what abuse, neglect, and exploitation are. And if somebody suspects abuse, neglect, or exploitation, they can reach out to a number of different entities. The first is certainly the Area Agency on Aging might have some resources depending on what the allegations are, what the concerns are. Law enforcement can be contacted. You can contact an elder law attorney who may be able to provide some information or resources depending on the facts and circumstances. You can reach out to the public fiduciary. The state of Arizona has a public fiduciary in every county, and the public fiduciary has the ability to investigate in certain capacities depending on the allegations and may be able to provide support, especially when the individual may not have their own assets or resources. And we're talking more on the physical abuse side where somebody can't protect themselves, they're vulnerable and they need the assistance. So there are resources available, and certain professionals do have a requirement to report. I think the two gentlemen on either side of me are well aware of that, as probably you are as well. They have an obligation to report, in particular, abuse, neglect, or exploitation if they're in a certain position with respect to an individual. And so it's very important for people to understand that there are resources and there is help.
Okay.
Well, they all answered the question very well. I'll just add that's one of the reasons we get to know our clients so well, so we can observe if certain things are happening in their homes. The most common is a new caregiver comes in and befriends, and all of a sudden more money's coming out of the checkbook. That has happened. That's probably the most common. The isolation, we certainly have experienced that, and so we have to watch out for that. And we do have a duty, so Adult Protective Services would be potentially a call. Usually my first call is to one of the elder care attorneys that we're talking. It's like, here's our situation, how might we want to proceed on this? But our main thing is to protect that individual the best we can. So.
And there's always two sides to a story. So how does one discern between who's telling the truth on this whole thing? That's got to be a challenge. Any thoughts on tools of the trade that one can use to help sort through the mess?
Steve, I'm happy to take that, hearing the panel being very quiet
Yeah,
right now.
I appreciate that, Stacey.
So when I get a phone call, if I get a call, let's say, from a child who lives out of state and their parent is in Arizona by themselves and they have concerns about a caregiver or accounts that they've been monitoring, sitting down and talking with folks, even if it's over the phone, and trying to get as much information as possible is critical. Sort of vetting and trying to figure out what the concerns are. Sometimes what somebody calls about isn't actually what they're really concerned about. They don't even know it. And so in that interview process, as a counselor, as a legal counselor, I try to ferret out exactly what the issues and concerns are, and if there are community resources we can tap, especially for the out-of-state folks, but even for the in-state folks, that can assist the family in ascertaining if there really is an issue, how serious the issue is, and what can be done to remedy the situation. There are, again, when you reach out to the Area Agency on Aging, when you reach out to other community resources and say, I've got this concern about mom, can you do a welfare check? Can you guide us toward an agency who would be able to maybe put in some services in the home? getting another set of eyes on the situation to help identify potential issues or problems is important in sorting out the different sides of the story.
Yeah.
It's also very frequent that you have somebody who isn't willing to admit that they've been taken advantage of. They're not willing to say, yes, so-and-so took $10,000 from me when I really only wanted to give them $1,000 for, the work that they'd done on the roof. They upcharged all of this or whatever, and I'm not calling out roofers here. But just as an example, the caregivers, the yard people, the people that tend to have contact with the individual on some type of frequent basis and maybe, are in a position to take advantage of them financially. It could be a mistake. It could be something the older adult or the individual who's vulnerable isn't willing or wanting to admit to, and it can be a very embarrassing situation for them. So trying to investigate, trying to come to the root of the problem and the concern, trying to resolve those issues while at the same time maintaining the dignity and respecting the individual that may be vulnerable is very critical.
Any other thoughts? We covered a couple good topics here right at the very end of our meeting here. Any other thoughts from the panel that would be pertinent?
Just a couple of red flags. When
Yeah.
I give presentations on this topic, I always talk about red flags, and I don't want to go through them all, but one of the most common red flags is isolation. When that person, elderly person typically, is being isolated by anyone, a family member, caregiver, that is a
Neighbor.
huge red flag. Neighbor,
Neighbors
yeah,
have a
anybody.
tendency
So
to-
if they're being isolated from their normal contact, red flag. Secondly, spending patterns. If they always spend their money in the past very conservatively, paying their bills and not much more, then all of a sudden they're spending doubles or triples in a short period of time, that's a huge red flag. And another one, which is kind of joking in a way, and Stacy will know what I mean, when a person calls me and describes a situation and then peppers the conversation with, it's not about the money, for me that's a
It's about
huge
the
red
money.
flag.
It can be.
So those are just a few. There are many others, but when you're trying to find out what the truth of the matter is, a lot of these red flags will kind of guide you toward, what really is true and not. Ask that person who's being exploited or abused without having the exploiter or abuser around, so they can speak freely. I've had to do that on a number of occasions, and sometimes they'll tell you everything when they feel like that person's not staring at them and giving them the evil eye, essentially. But when they're in the presence of the other person, they'll tell a different story. So if you're going to kind of investigate, keep that in mind.
Good points.
I just got one comment.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll raise up this. We've been down this hole that's a little disturbing part of our humanity, but let's step back at the good news. Is like we have very, very good lawyers in this town. We have very, very good fiduciaries in this town. We have very, very good investment professionals. And very, very good accountants and CPAs. We're very, very fortunate, I think, at the talent level in our professional community. And it's fairly economical vis-a-vis if you're looking at Los Angeles or New York and what I see the fees there. And if you just step back and just do the proper planning from your wills and your trusts and your medical powers and all the different things that Stacy's firm does for the things, you do that, you have the backstop that will alleviate 90% of these problems we talked about. And so I would just recommend everybody you kind of bite the bullet and get it done, and then you will rest a lot easier. So
That is an excellent note to end our conversation on, because we are just about out of time. And I would like to thank the Central Arizona State Planning Council for providing our panelists, and of course the panelists themselves, and your public radio station for providing this program, and our viewers, and we hope the program increased your knowledge on the subject. Thank you and good day.